And people have often wondered, and I used to wonder when I was growing up, how does Revelation 13 play out? The Word of God reveals in that chapter that there is going to come a time when the second beast of Revelation 13, whom we believe to be the United States of America, is going to enforce global economic sanctions at an individual level. So you cannot neither buy nor sell, ultimately leading to the death penalty for those who are faithful to God and his commandments rather than the laws of men. And I want to talk tonight about some factors that are taking place in our world that really shows that the architecture and the institutional mechanisms are being put in place in front of our very eyes that will enable that end-time crisis and end-time economic warfare on God's people to take place. So I called it Megatrends and Religious Liberty. And I'm going to look at three trends here this evening. The first is going to be looking at the fourth industrial revolution. The second is going to be looking at the onset of CBDCs. Those are central bank digital currencies, what those mean for us in the very near future. And the third is looking at some of the ideological division that is sweeping the West, even as we sit here in 2022. So just to set some of the wider context for CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. And so Western governments are now actively developing and working on the rollout of CBDCs, or central bank digital currencies. Now, CBDCs will centralize economic power with the central banks and national governments in a way probably never seen before in the West. And that is not a hyperbolic statement. We've lived through many economic ups and downs, many economic changes in the last 1,000 years in the West. But perhaps the closest analogy is the famine of Egypt when Joseph was there, where the people sold everything they had in order to buy food from the Pharaoh. Then they sold their land and gave it to the Pharaoh. Then they sold themselves into slavery in order to get food from the Pharaoh. And that's perhaps the closest analogy to what is happening with these CBDCs. So, for instance, Tom Mutton, he's the Director of Financial Technology at the Bank of England. He was at a conference in March this year, and what he said there included this phrase. He said, there could be some socially beneficial outcomes for that, preventing activity which is seen to be socially harmful in some way, end quote. So what is he saying here? What he's saying is that with the new CBDCs, governments can pre-program those currencies so they can only be spent on what the government thinks is a desirable expenditure. So, for instance, you can buy bread, but you may not be able to buy the book Great Controversy, all right? And these currencies can be programmed, and they will be programmed so that all expenditure is in line with what the government wants you to spend your money on, rather than what you want to spend your money on. So, in a sense, the CBDCs, and this is where we're going all across the West, including here in America, will be like an extended version of the electronic benefit cards that many people use in America, the food cards. And with those food cards, for many years, you could buy processed food, but you could not buy organic vegetables. That was a predetermined decision made by your state or federal government that says you can spend these food stamps electronically on crisps or chocolates, but you cannot buy organic vegetables. And that's a good example of how the government will pre-program what you are and are not allowed to spend these new digital currencies on. And the US federal government is now actively seeking much greater oversight over cryptocurrencies and all of your personal transactions with your current dollars, even before we get to CBDCs. So this interesting paper came out just a couple of months ago, and it was why the US should reject central bank digital currencies. And it's a fascinating paper, but if you look at the financial news in the mainstream media, there's a lot of journalists raising a lot of red flags about the onset of CBDCs. And in the 20th century, you might say the American century, we tended to emphasize and celebrate liberal democracy and free market capitalism. And even if we didn't put it into practice, we at least idealized smaller government because we recognized the temptation to authoritarianism and corruption implicit in human leaders in very powerful economic and political systems. But in the 21st century, that some call the Chinese century, it seems that we're moving away from the ideal of small government with more individual freedom in favor of much more powerful government and much more limited personal freedom, in which a strong state directs the economic and social activities of the community and the social values of an entire population. So what are some of the problems with CBDCs? And I've just given you a list of some of the problems here. Well, firstly, CBDCs will penalize low-income households. And it's an interesting fact that in America and in many other parts of the world, low-income families generally avoid the banking system at all costs. And why is that? It's because low-income families operate on very, very thin margins. And if you are a multi-billionaire, you are almost never going to use your overdraft. You're not going to incur overdraft fees or penalties or service fees. But if you are living from paycheck to paycheck, and in fact, you're getting payday loans just to survive from paycheck to paycheck, the chances are that if you have a bank account, you're going to be going into the red. And that's going to incur overdraft fees and penalties and late service fees and so forth. And so many low-income households do not want anything to do with the banking sector as it currently is, because they're the ones most likely to be affected by the fees and the penalties. But the CBDCs would force every household in the economy to be part of the new economic system. Secondly, every transaction would now be taxed, even among transactions among family members and in the unofficial economy. So, for instance, if I say to my teenage son, please go and mow the lawn and I'll give you $10 for your time, I'm going to give him $10 and he'll put it in his pocket, but that's not subject to taxation. Okay, that's just a cash transfer from me to my son, and that does not get recorded with the IRS in any way, shape, or form. My son does not have to pay income tax on that. But if everything is now done digitally via CBDC, then every transaction will be taxed, because there are no possible transactions outside of the system. And that is where we're going with CBDC. So every transaction will be taxed, and the unofficial economy, such as me paying my son to cut the lawn, that will no longer exist unless I go back to barter. With CBDCs, every bank account can be taxed at source via a haircut. And we in America, we're not used to the concept of a haircut. But in 2005, 2006, and 2007, and the Greek economy was in real crisis. In fact, it has been ever since then. And in order to, there was an oversupply of euros in Greek bank accounts as far as the European Central Bank was concerned. And in order to bail out the Greek government from the economic crisis, one of the components of the deal was that everybody had to have a haircut. And so people across Greece and in Cyprus, if you had a euro account, which was most people, the government simply took 10% of your accounts overnight. There was nothing you could do about it. And this is a haircut, known as a haircut. And so when you have CBDCs, the government can simply tax whatever they want from your account, and you have no control over this. And governments do make these decisions, and they make them overnight, and they generally don't make them with the interests of the citizens at heart.